the closer the light source relative to your subject, the softer the light, and basic principles of lighting your subject. So how's it going, guys? This is Ryo Murata, photographer based in Tokyo. In this video I wanted to talk about shooting with a flash on the GW690, and you guys have been waiting for it. The GW690 from Fujifilm is my main medium format camera, and I thought it would be a great time to mention this topic on my channel. And this is going to be a relatively long video because I'm going to be talking about on-camera flash and off-camera flash. And because a lot of people who are new to photography might be thinking of like shooting with a flash on their film camera, and I thought it would be nice to like mention that. So just a recap for people who are new to flash photography. On-camera flash, typically we use sort of like a flash unit called speedlights, and these come in basically two flavors. A small compact type. The one that I use is Godox TT350. The F stands for Fujifilm, which run on 2 AA batteries, and a standard size speedlight is much larger. It's like double the size of the one that I have, but it uses 4 AA batteries. And this is sort of like a toss-up between portability versus light output. The standard size has more light output, but it uses more batteries, and it's a little bit heavier, it's clunkier, and it might get in your way when you're traveling. Well, if you're like someone like me who rarely uses speedlights, I would prefer to have my setup lightweight, and I love this TT350 from Godox, which is less than half the size, but it uses only 2 batteries. And although the light output is smaller, it's much more compact and manageable for me to work with. But unfortunately, I haven't used it for a long time, unfortunately. So for educational purposes, I'm going to be talking about using speedlight in this video. So, and also in addition to that, they also come in 2 flavors, a manual speedlight or a TTL speedlight. And basically it's sort of like a price difference. The price difference is roughly like 2-3 times more expensive on the TTL version versus the manual flash. And if I'm right, a manual flash would go roughly from like $50 to $60-$70, while a TTL flash would go from $200 to maybe $200 to maybe up to the $500 if you get the brand ones from Nikon and Canon, which I don't highly recommend, unfortunately. And yeah, so a manual speedlight is basically a speedlight where you have fully 100% manual control over that light, and you basically sort of like turn the dial to sort of like change the output of the light. While the TTL, on the other hand, the TTL stands for like through the lens metering, which basically means that the light itself, when you mount it onto your camera, sort of like communicates with each other, and it kind of automatically decides how much light is entering the camera, and basically the light itself basically changes the light output automatically. And I have to mention this, but TTL, in terms of film cameras, there's not many cameras that offer that functionality, unfortunately, and GW690 from Fuji is no exception. If it's a fully manual camera, it has a high chance of not having that ability to like shoot TTL, while the more sort of like modern cameras, film cameras such as a Nikon F100, if I'm right, Nikon F6, the professional range, have TTL function built into the system, so it can work with a TTL flash. But the GW690 doesn't have that functionality, which means that when I'm like shooting with a flash, I basically have to manually sort of like change the dial, sort of like turn the dial to change the output of that flash unit. This TTL functionality like really relatively depends on what you want to do. Typically TTL is mostly used in, I guess, bridal photographers. My friend who works as a bridal photographer uses TTL a lot. Like I said, TTL automatically detects how much light is entering the camera from looking at the shutter speed, the ISO, and also the how much because there's a built-in light meter within a digital camera, it can basically automatically sense that and kind of relays that information to the flash, and the flash can basically change at a fast pace. So if you're in a fast shooting environment, TTL works really nice. But in most cases when we're shooting with a sort of like a film camera, we have a lot of time at our hand, and because we're using a manual camera, it's, I guess, best to use in that manual settings within our flash system, so we can basically like turn the dial and change the flash output to our desired, results and stuff like that. And also, in addition to that, I have to mention that speedlights in general, you can basically, either way, the manual ones and TTL flash have this functionality. You can basically sort of like choose how wide the spread of light can be shot at. What I'm trying to say is, depending on what kind of lens you're using on your film camera, you could be using a wide angle lens, or you could use sort of like a telephoto lens. And you guys know that spread of coverage when you shoot that image will differ. And same for speedlights, you can basically alter the spread of light. And for the TT350 by Godox, actually, I can basically choose between 16 millimeters and to up into 69 millimeters. And the GW690 is 90mm f3.5 if I'm right lens, but when we convert that to 35, this is on 35mm scale, it becomes the GW690 3rd generation 3 becomes a 40-50mm lens on a 35mm scale. So when I'm shooting with a GW690, I basically designate it to that range of focal length. So I would set it to around 40 or maybe 50 if I want. And honestly, this is just my honest opinion, but if we ever have a speedlight and if you want to shoot with a film camera beforehand, I would highly suggest like trying it and testing it out on a digital camera, because typically a digital mirrorless camera or a DSLR already has a hot shoe. So if you just stick this like what we call speedlight on top of your like mirrorless or a digital camera, you can basically sort of like pre-imagine where the light's gonna hit on your subject. It could be like a wall, which is a great like way of like testing to see like what is the area of the coverage of that speedlight, and depending on what kind of speedlight you use, the area of coverage will differ. And like I said, you can basically zoom into your sort of like area of coverage using that speedlight. It could be 60mm, it could be or wide 60mm, so you get it sort of like an idea of how much it can cover and relative to the distance and stuff like that. So that's what I would highly recommend before you go out and shoot with film installed in your camera, because most cases you're gonna fail and we don't want that to happen. So beforehand, as a preparation, might be wise to sort of like use a mirrorless or a digital camera to see how much light output is emitting from the light source and relative to your subject and stuff like that. So, and after the sort of like understanding the basic principles of the speedlight and flash and how it works, basically it's really simple to mount this onto the GW690. It's exactly the same as mounting a speedlight onto a digital camera. There is a hot shoe. You basically slide it in nice and slowly and just turn on the speedlight, and you can basically, because like I said, it is a fully manual camera, and I can basically set it into the manual sort of configuration, select the sort of like the output, and basically turn the dial if I want more output or less output. And one thing to note, that the higher the output, the longer it will take to recharge that, flash basically. So 1/1 is a sort of like a max output. If I fire that, it takes roughly 1 to 2 seconds to recharge, and the LED indicator in the back basically glows red when it's ready, and I can fire again. And that's basically it, honestly, on camera like flash. And there's nothing to like talk about, unfortunately, but because the GW690 has this weird quirk that in order to fire the shutter without film installed in the GW690, you have to like open the back plate. It's similar to like Pentax 67. There's a way to like fire the shutter without film installed, and I did not want to like waste a film on this day, unfortunately. But the same principle applies when you're having film in there. You just get it to the start position and you basically go to the first frame, and when you fire, it basically sinks into the camera and it kind of fires exact same time when the shutter is fired. So that's it actually. So off camera flash photography, this gets a little bit hectic because there's like 3 to 5 ways of doing it. And if I'm right, one way is using sort of like a radio trigger, such as I long time ago used a Yongnuo RF 603 Mark II, was it? Like 10 years ago. And you basically, I think it comes in a pack of 2 actually. You attach one to your camera, you attach another one to the speedlight, and it basically uses sort of like a radio frequency, and you can basically fire off from a distance. And because unfortunately my Yongnuo RF603, which I used 10 years ago, broke down on me, I can't show you the process, but that is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is you can basically use, because I use a Godox flash, the reason why I use Godox, unfortunately, is because their system's like really well integrated. They have a wireless trigger called the X Pro trigger, and if you shoot full time in the digital space, you guys probably know what I'm talking about, but a lot of people don't know about this. But Godox, their brands specifically, have their own designated sort of like triggers called the X Pro series. And this is basically similar to the Yongnuo. You slide this into the GW690, and basically I can put this on a light stand far away, like 1 meter, maybe 2 meters away from my subject, and I can basically fire that way. This way is much more efficient due to the fact that the Godox series of lights, you can basically change the light output from your camera instead of just walking 1, 2, 3 meters away from your subject, going back and forth, change the light output, going back and stuff like that. You don't have to do that. So that's why I use the Godox system. It just works in my opinion. Unfortunately, this system is much more expensive. The trigger costs like $70–$80 if I'm right. And you basically have to invest more for the system to work, and you have to buy another sort of like accessories and stuff like that. And third would be using a sort of like a physical cable. It's similar to like tether shooting actually. There is a cable called the sync cable. You can find it on Amazon, and you can basically sort of like, depending on your camera, the GW690 is an exception actually. It has a sort of like a PC sync terminal, if that's the word, right word, English word, and that basically goes in here, and that cable you can run towards your light actually. And typically speedlights, I think the majority of them have some kind of, oh, this one doesn't unfortunately. So the TT350 does not have a sync cable sort of like jack, but typically a standard size sort of like speedlights have that jack where you basically run that cable through to your camera, and you can basically sort of like connect it that way and you can fire from a distance. This is, I never do it due to the fact that if you have a cable running from your light to your camera, someone's gonna trip over if you're shooting a model, and at the same time it can get like destroyed, you know. It's like a phone cable, it could get torn down and you don't get any inputs and stuff like that. So I typically don't use cables unfortunately, but I think back in the days like 10–20 years ago, professional used that way because it was the most efficient way possible. And at the same time, for cameras that don't have this PC sync cable terminal kind of thing, magic actually, there's actually a accessory where you can put a small block on top of the hot shoe, and it has this PC cable input. I don't know, I'll just stick in a photo right here and so you guys can understand what I'm talking about. But you can basically put that cable from the side, and it basically, like, I guess connects to the camera, and you can basically fire the shutter far away. And last but not least, there's like studio flash, which right now I don't have that in my home. It is at my workplace, unfortunately. But depending on the manufacturer, such as Profoto, Broncolors, they have their own designated wireless triggers, and probably that will work on any kind of film camera or any kind of digital camera actually. And you can basically wirelessly transmit using radio frequencies to fire that flash far away from a distance, and also can change the light output. Obviously, that is really expensive, and I guess the cheapest route for off-camera flash is using a wireless trigger that I mentioned, the Yongnuo RF603, if they still sell it. Godox actually sells their FC, oh my goodness, I don't know the name, FC16 or something. I'm using it at my workplace actually, which is like $20 or so, and you can basically attach one to your flash unit and one on your camera, and it should sync if I'm right. And yeah, I think I keep missing out on something, but GW690, this is actually another interesting topic because GW690 from Fujifilm, although it's supposed to be used as back in the days as a group photo camera and landscape photographers. I don't know why this camera in particular uses a leaf shutter. Actually, I should have said this in the first part of the video, but leaf shutter is actually much better than a typical focal plane shutter. Focal plane shutter is found within most 35mm film cameras. The shutter curtain goes up and it kind of closes, or the vice versa, while leaf shutter basically closes like a leaf. Actually, it kind of shrinks in by rotating and stuff like that. Leaf shutters are actually much better, especially when we're doing sort of like flash photography, due to the fact that the time it sort of syncs with the flash is much more faster than a focal plane shutter. Nowadays, focal plane shutters gotten really good that you can basically sync up to 1/200th of a second, but this is like really important. But mechanical type of cameras, film cameras, 35mm especially the Nikon F3, F2 in the first F, if I'm right, syncs with a flash at a duration of 1/60th of a second. And people who are new don't know much, but when you shoot a photo outside 1/60th of a second, ISO 100, f8 or so, we get a really bright photo, right? Hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about. But what's important when we're like shooting outside with a flash is it's important to cut down as much ambient light as possible, because the more ambient light there is, and on top of that we shoot with a flash, we get a super overexposed image. And typically when we shoot with a manual camera like a 35 Nikon F3, that becomes like really overblown, overexposed, unfortunately. And the great thing about these types of cameras that have leaf shutter is, like I said, we can shoot at I think the GW690 can shoot at 1/500th of a second and can also sync with a flash, meaning that if we shoot outside at 1/500th of a second, we'll get a pitch dark image, right? But on top of that, if we shoot with a flash, we can basically illuminate the subject, and then the background we can basically cut down the ambient light as much as we want. So this is much more efficient when we're doing flash, especially outdoors, with a camera that can sync up to like 1/500th of a second, compared to cameras that can't like sync up to that. And this is sort of like a drawback for focal plane shutters and stuff like that, but it's gonna get like really complicated. So just remember that some cameras can sync up to really fast shutter speeds, while some cameras cannot do that. And if you're into like flash photography, or if you're thinking of doing flash photography, before you purchase that camera, or any kind of film cameras that have that, you know, functionality, just remember what is that sync speed of that camera, because in most cases the 35 Nikon F3 can only sync up to 1/60th of a second, and it's not the best camera to shoot in a studio, unfortunately. If you're shooting in a studio, I would highly suggest a camera that can shoot above 1/200th of a second. Most digital cameras, mirrorless cameras, can sync up to that, no, they can even go beyond that, unfortunately. So that's like one of the drawbacks of like film cameras. The Mamiya 645, I think it's the same, because it uses a focal plane shutter. Mamiya 645 can sync up to 1/60th of a second, if I'm right. So it's not a studio camera, unfortunately, but the GW690 is a studio camera. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully I helped a lot of people, but at the same time might have lost some people. So if you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. I'm happy to reply on flash photography, because I do it as that's my main job, e-commerce photographer. And at the same time, I have to like mention this, but I wouldn't suggest having the speed light on top of your camera unless if it's the last resort, due to the fact that this is like lighting principles. If you have your camera like facing this way, and if you have the light source exactly at the same angle, you get a super flat image, and that's not what we want, right? I mean for some people, if we're like shooting, or if we have some kind of intention of doing that, I guess that might work. But having the flash at a sort of like a far away angle, maybe from 45-degree angles from the left, or maybe from the right, or maybe from the side, we can dramatically change that atmosphere. We can basically sort of like sort of like be much more creative once we take that, you know, flash or light source away from our subject. I mean, let me move. This doesn't look good. I'm moving my light source. Oh, that's better. That's better. Closer. Oh yeah, that looks better. So once we have that light source and like away from our subject, or maybe from an angle actually, we can basically like improve the quality of the light. And if I have the light source in front of me, it might look, man, oh, it looks disgusting. Yeah, so basically if you shoot with a flash in front, you'll get something like this. This is wrong. But if you have it all on a distance, like on the right side, it looks much better. Yeah, 45-degree angle. Yeah. My light stand's gonna fall. This is, yeah. Why does it feel so unstable? So yeah, so I went off topic, but hope I made some kind of like meaning in this video. So yeah, if you have any questions, please leave in the comments below. I'm happy to reply. So yeah, we will see you next time. Peace out.